Hey y'all. A few days ago, I sent out a quiz asking people to self-assess how much of a meta player they are when it comes to Star Rail. And well, the results may or may not be shocking. This time, though, we have a special guest to co-commentate these results with everyone. You may know him from his Currency Wars or Beta Breakdown videos, but say hi to Uniquely.
Hello everyone, I'll be your co-host of today's video, but to give a general idea of today's format, it will be in the style of a podcast in which we'll be covering interesting results from a set test to see if we could get any insight on endgame players. Then we'll give our opinion or interpretation of why that may be the case. Now, while our intro will rely on a script, everything afterwards will have us working off our personal notes, so you'll be getting our genuine thoughts as opposed to this well-prepared presentation. It'll be both our first times doing something like this, so bear with us if things get a bit scuffed here and there. But before we jump into the nitty gritty, let's have Mr. Deck break down who exactly took the test.
Alright, thanks Mr. Yoon. So from my estimates, it seems like about 80% of respondents were notified of this post from Twitter, 10% came over from mine and Yoon's advertising efforts, and the last 10% were from scattered Honkai Star Rail focused Discord servers. As such, the audience we'll be basing our overall findings around should have a decent mix of casual and hardcore players. But remember, at the end of the day, this quiz is just for fun, and it operates entirely on the honor system, so don't feel like your account is bricked or anything like that if your score is a bit lower than you'd expect. And before I forget, shout out to the Discord servers that participated, many of which I'm probably missing here, as well as everyone else that was part of this massive pool of submissions. All your comments and even the rare Discord DMs are read and appreciated.
With that said, let's get on with the actual results from the test. So from the test, we had 9,800 people answered, which is crazy by the way. As for the average score, it was 34 questions answered. Now I'll pass it over to Mr. Alpaca to see his thoughts on this.
So yeah, I definitely made this quiz a lot harder than maybe people were expecting. Like if you're accustomed to the idea of like 50% or 70% being average, it's definitely a lot lower. I made this test originally to like kind of capture the whole range of players, from like the people who just like play occasionally to the very hardcore like super whale plight zero cyclers. So naturally, I think the average is expected to be a lot lower. I think the last time we did this, the previous average was somewhere in the 30s as well. So yeah, that's pretty normal. So let's see. Out of the players that answered, we had about 36% that were familiar with the action value formula, as opposed to 62% that knew the speed breakpoint for 3 actions in the zero cycle, which is 200 speed. I find this difference pretty interesting, since it kind of reflects the idea that players are more likely to memorize one specific number than they are to memorize like a whole formula and work out things for themselves, which I think comes out a lot in just like trying to work out what teams are like good for endgame. Typically, I think those that are seen as easier to pilot have like one very specific breakpoint. Like if you think about like Sunday teams with just their fixed 134 speed, those are usually a bit more popular versus teams like, I don't know, like Elation, for example, where a lot of people don't even know AHA speed, and like there's kind of estimates about how you should speed tune your team members, and also the speed tuning depends on like the other members' speed as well, and as well as how many Elation characters you have on the team. Yes, it's just kind of complicated in that respect.
I see. So, what do you think about just 36% of people knowing what the formula is? Because in my opinion, I think it's actually super low, and it kind of makes sense because when I've seen my friends play, right, many of them wouldn't actually have the AV setting on, right? So they're kind of just going with the flow. So I think in general, when it comes to many players, even if it's for endgame players, a lot of them, like what you said, are probably using like specific breakpoints. Example, say like some people might know 200. I think 134 is the baseline for most people. But I think 160 speed though is like super interesting because I feel like most people have no idea why people even want 160. What do you think?
Well, I think people are familiar with like with what 160 does at some point. It's the 2 cycle breakpoint, if I remember correctly, right?
Uh-huh, yeah.
Or like, yeah, if you're going into like zero cycles, it's like the zero cycle, and then the first cycle, it'll net you 2 actions. But I think for other reasons too, 160 speed is generally pretty good. Like a lot of enemies will have 158.4 speed, so outspeeding them is generally usually pretty useful. Like if you think about like Nikador, for example, he has 158.4 speed. So it's useful for other reasons as well.
What's it called? I agree. I think most of the enemies that I've come across are probably around like 155, and I think many of my units are built around like 160, but that's probably just because I'm trying to make them go as fast as possible. But I think for many players, they probably don't know the intention behind the 160 speed, and I think as such, I think the speed stat is actually like super misunderstood, right? Because if you're building like 160 speed, but you're not getting or like you're not finishing within the first cycle, then I'm gonna be honest, the speed stat was like completely wasted, and you could like put that into either crit or like attack percent or whatever you're scaling with.
Yeah, I think that's usually how it turns out. Like it's normal to like set your standards to like one breakpoint, and then as soon as your teams like adjust to like not update that speed to better match your new teams. I think that goes kind of back to what I mentioned earlier about players preferring to stick to one specific breakpoint rather than have to learn a formula and have to recalculate their speed every single time for every single new team.
Yeah, that's fair. I think for many of my units, I just have them at like one speed breakpoint and then they just perma stay there. I do not change it. I think for many DPSs, again, 135 is a pretty good breakpoint. And then for other ones, you either stick at 100 or try to make them go as fast as possible. If they need to apply, say, like tutorial and plus defense shred stuff, just like that with all that ego shenanigans. Moving on, we now have question 11, knowing the difference between a limited and standard cost. Now, from according to the test, we have 80% of people actually know the difference. Now, in my opinion, I think 80% is kind of low because in the name, it kind of tells you it, you know? We have limited and standard, so you would assume it's limited character and standard character. If I had to assume why it's only 80%, it's probably people just not knowing what the cost system is in general. Now, I believe the original cost or gold system originated from China and referred to limited lycons or eidolons counting as one, as it gave people an idea of the relative power of the team. But recently, I think the cost definition has gotten super murky, right? Alpaca, you want to chime on this one with maybe some E4 Welt shenanigans?
The idea of limited and standard cost has kind of been a little bit nebulous in that the I guess the amount of how much standard cost should count as in relative to like a limited cost, it really has changed a lot. Like for instance, back when the Herda was like 205, I remember standard costs counted as half of a limited cost, whereas with the current system, they actually count as like less than one limited cost. So, like for instance, if you had a three limited cost plus five standard cost run, then that would be less than a three limited plus like 21 standard, right? Which makes sense. But that 3 plus 21 would still be ranked lower than a 4 plus 0, for instance, like 4 limited units, 0 standards. So I think it's been a little bit of a point of frustration for people who are trying to sort by cheapest clears, especially when it comes to like the Herda website. That's been a little bit of a topic of frustration. But I do think that it's a little bit overblown. Like in terms of like Welt E4, right? Obviously, Welt E4 incredibly powerful, right? E2 fixes his energy issue so that he's able to have more consistent ults, and then E4 is that trademark 30% res pen. Obviously, I think a lot of people take issue with that only counting as like less than one cost. But I think in terms of that regard, the website does have like ways to specifically filter it out, which I believe only 25% of users have reportedly used. So there is that. But yeah, I think, in my opinion, I think as long as the cost system is consistent, because realistically, no matter how it's set up, like there's gonna be people who PvP about it. So I think the appropriate thing to do is to just stick to a cost system. Like whether it's your own, whether it's someone else's. Like, just find one that you can find suitable for you and hopefully translates well to other people, and then just stick to that. And then I think decide based on how much you can afford additionally, like how relatable that cost is to you.
I would say that I think cost is pretty useful in determining how strong a team is, like relatively. Because if you were to compare, or if you were to add, like, say, a singular cost, right? Let's just say a Lycone, I think we can generally expect around a team increase depending if it's the main DPS or support one, maybe 10 to 24% depending on which one it was, right? So if we just add that, we can tell that a lot of the other stuff or the performance was probably made up with either, say, substats, your relics, or just say like you're just playing extremely well, right? So I think when we see something like Welt, right? In terms of amp, according to my previous chart, he actually is, in most cases, above, let's see, E0, S0, or a E4, S0 Welt is above a E0, S0 Blade, right? Which makes him extremely strong. Now, I think in my opinion, like realistically, if they were started treating E4 Welt as just a one limited cost, I think that would be pretty fair. However, you know, that it would go against how the naming system like currently works. So I think Welt is kind of like in an exception right now just because he got no fettered and is exceptionally strong. Meanwhile, when you look at other units, so I have a E6 S5 Bronya, and I'm tell you what, she's Leduki. So if I were to use her, then if I had to put, what is that? That's like 11 or 12 costs from my Bronya alone, just to get the performance, that's probably worse than like an E0 S1 Sunday. So there's that. But I think something hilarious that I want to talk about in regards to cost is, does free count as cost, right? Because at this point, Archer, Ratio, Sparkle, and all those people, right, at one point have been given out for free, and you know, some people may argue that those characters don't count as a cost. But Mr. Alpaca, what do you think about that one?
Well, I think in the sense of like relevant cost, that is true. Like, sure, you didn't have to pay any extra to get something that you claim for free, but I think if you want to have cost as like a sort of measuring system, it's important to have like some sort of consistency. Like with the free characters, as long as they're like available at some point to roll on in a banner, I do think it makes sense to just have those characters listed as additional cost anyways. Just because it's good to remain consistent. Like, sure, we all know that like an E6 Yen Ching is not nearly as powerful as like an E6 Welt, but they still are both like 6 standard pulls. So, like, I think the cost system isn't really good at like determining power, and at the same time, like using the cost system to try and determine what pulls may be optimal for you may not always be great either. Because let's say, for example, you have like an E2 Firefly team, and you want to think about like, should I pull like E2 Dahlia, or should I pull like the next like premium unit? Let's say like E2 like Silverwolf. So even though like the total cost of the E2 Silverwolf team might be a little bit lower, let's say like just E2 S0 Silverwolf and then one E0 S0 Yao Guang, that might be like 4 cost. And then you compare that to like the Firefly team, which is like 6 cost. You're still like, you might even be like pulling a little bit, adding a little bit less additional cost to your account, since you know you're only required to pull that additional E2 Dahlia, which is 3 extra cost. So I think in terms of recording, like having, if you want to set up like a cost system, it makes the most sense for me to have all units, regardless of if they were free or not, all count as like one limited cost or one standard cost, depending on what they are, and then you can determine how much additional cost your accounts needs on an individual basis, because I think it really is account dependent.
You know what? I would agree. I think one thing, like when you're trying to measure like strength in regards to cost, that is a bit hard to do, if not impossible, because the cost in itself is assuming every one of these costs have like a similar amount of like damage increase, right? So, for example, let's just say we added two costs. Two costs Finon is absolutely not the same as adding two costs to Sunday. Completely different performance. But in regards to the cost itself, in my opinion, I think a 5-star is a 5-star and it's just one cost. Because when you were to see, oh, and in regards to the free thing, if we were to see Archer, Sparkle, Danheng PT, and Gilgamesh, that's not a zero cost team and equivalent to Arlen, Tingyun, Pela, Natasha, okay? There's clearly one team that is significantly stronger, okay? But with the Welt scamming and the cost system down, let's move on to the next question. Question 15, where you skipped the character you loved because you were disappointed in their meta performance. Now, we had a whopping 34% of people fill that out, that they skipped their favorites because they were a bit too weak. Now, I have quite a bit to say, but I'll pass it to Apaka on this one.
Yeah, so I think 34% or like about one in every three people is pretty fair. I know there's like quite a lot of people who play this game for the end game. Since I guess besides story, there isn't like too much to do, so meta value matters a lot to them. I think I consider myself in that camp as well. But I think something interesting is how this 1 in 3 stat is significantly smaller than the over 50% of people that skip the character rather because they lack the supports to make their team properly function. I think a lot of the characters nowadays, as long as you have like their full investments, their full team loadouts, they are able to successfully clear endgame. So from these stats at least, what we can see is that what determines whether or not you pull a character you like or skip them, it's not necessarily how strong their meta power is, because at the top of the meta, like you can usually make that character work, given you have all their supports, but rather how much you're able to pull that character as well as like get all of their complete supports. Because I think if you really like a character, it you don't want to be like playing them at like suboptimally or like without their full power, you know?
Wait, okay, I agree. I think, but you said that 1 in 3 was a like a fair amount of people skipping, right?
Yeah.
Because personally, I thought 34% was a crazy number, okay? I thought it was super, super high. And if I had to assume, maybe like 10% or something. Because starting at 2.x, I think the only ones that I would list as relatively weak, right, would be Jade, Jiaoqiu, Lingsha. And those were like the only like weak ones. But even, or given the meta back then, they were actually still pretty strong. But I think everyone past Emphorius, every single unit has either been tier 0 or tier 0.5 on release. So legit, every single character has been meta. So I have no idea if people are skipping their favorites because they're weak, because none of them are weak. And then when we go to say 4.x, right, in Planar Arcadia, none of them have been weak. Every single one has been disgustingly OPSL, right? Let's see, we have Yao Guang, Evanesia, Silverwolf, Blade, Ashvale, and then the future characters, all tier 0, every single one of them, right? So if we're skipping them because they're weak, I'm not sure where that's coming from.
I think if you mention all those characters, it actually does kind of make more sense, I think, why people are more likely to skip their characters, especially if we're using like Pridwin's tier rating system, because one important thing about their rating system is that they assume that everyone has like all their teammates. For instance, with like Silverwolf and like Evanesia, for example, like both of them, like without Yao Guang, like they just don't nearly function to the same extent. Like I dare say they drop like to tier 1, if not like even lower, without like their one critical support. And the way that Elation's release schedule was like released, it was pretty much impossible to like pull for like Yao Guang, knowing that like Superwolf and Evanesia were gonna be needing them without looking at like the forbidden arts, so to say. And like even then it's like so much did end up changing during the like the beta cycles, that it wasn't really a wise decision to like put your eggs in one basket. So I think it's one thing to like pull your favorite character, but like I think it's another thing to have them be like functional in endgame to like that promised tier zero potential. And I think without supports, that just doesn't happen.
So, you know what? I absolutely agree, and this goes back to question 16, right? Where people skip because they didn't have the proper teammates. And then the statistic was 51% that skipped because they didn't have a team. Now, I would also be there because I know that my personal account, it will never be able to get a dot in follow-up because if I were to try invest into it at this point, like it's just bricked. Even if I were to like there's a new meta dot unit because I don't have the team, I know performance wise, like realistically speaking, it's gonna be tier 2. However, I think the statistic of 51% having skipped, I think if we look at the opposite way, I think it's way more interesting. 49% of you guys said screw it, I like them, so I'm gonna pull them. So even if you have a 0 dot or break units, it seems these people still pulled anyway, which I think is a very bold move. Maybe not the wisest though.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much you can do. Like, if you really, really don't like a character, then and they end up being like essential to the team, then what can you do, right? Or let's say if you have like a character, maybe you're banking on getting the supports like later in the future, right? I think that's what ended up happening with quite a lot of people who like pulled early into Elation.
I also initially pulled Yao Guang, right? But I pulled E1S1. And funnily enough, she was actually like extremely strong in funny carry teams where everyone was a DPS. But I knew I was playing Honkai Future Rail, which I know some people aren't a fan of, but like other people like me, that's what I do. That's what I think should be ideal, right? I mean, because I'm just like, there's probably gonna be a unit that like fits them, right? But I was wondering, like in regards to this, do you think it's better that the support or sub DPS comes out first and then the actual DPS? Or would it be better to have something like a caster situation where on release, she castress, like I'm gonna be honest, completely unplayable without Hyacinth?
Well, I think having a DPS first would definitely be better, just because I don't, especially with the way that supports are becoming way more niche nowadays, to where you really want to pull them with a specific DPS in mind. Like, for example, we have like Ceridra for Anaxa and Phynon, and I guess you could use her for like Stila Nova Flare teams nowadays, but no one was pulling Ceridra back then thinking about that, right? It was just for one of the two male Chrysos heirs. Um, I I think having a DPS comes first as well, because usually I think DPS don't release as like unplayable. I'd say like I think that's what the endgame shield buffs really help them do. But then if characters have like a DPS first on release, like she was totally fine without her Hyacine. I think the endgame content was easy enough to where she was kind of just brute forcing things anyways. And yeah, sure, Hyacine definitely did elevate her performance a lot, but the fact like she, I guess specific to Casterus's case, the fact that she was needed to play with a sustain yet was outputting similar results to sustainless teams made her completely fine until like the Hyacine DLC came out. Whereas with something like the Yao Guang situation, right? If you had Yao Guang first, you really weren't able to optimally use her anywhere. Like, I guess there was the Sparksicon boss you could cheese by having Yao Guang remove the 50% damage reduction from the subfield mobs, but that was kind of only temporary. And as soon as the shield disappeared, if you didn't like the DPS that she came with, then like she was kind of just there to sit pretty on your account. So I definitely think having a DPS first is a lot more important, just because it's a lot easier to figure out whether you like the playstyle based on the DPS rather than like on the support, if that makes any sense.
That's a really good point. Now, I think initially I was gonna say I would prefer the support coming first, right? But then after you mentioned Shill, I was like, you know what, that actually makes a lot more sense. Because I think in the past instances, right, it would usually be, say, DPS and then support. And then so like, let's say like Silverwolf, like if Superwolf were to release before Yao Guang, right? Realistically speaking, she actually would be okay because of all the shield in the end game, right? Which would help you for maybe like 1 or 2 patches until like the actual dedicated support comes, right? But nowadays, because we have the support come first and then the DPS, Well, now you're getting both best of both worlds, and then you also get the additional shill, which makes them look way better than like what they're supposed to. But because of how they kind of flip-flopped it around, the shill just kind of like completely elevates them and makes them look extremely boosted, in my opinion.
Yeah, like having the benchmark of like DPS with support plus shill, and then going down to just like regular DPS plus support, rather than going from DPS plus shill to DPS plus best in slot support. It's definitely like a way more drastic difference. I feel. Yeah, so I definitely agree with you in that regard.
Okay, let's see. Moving on to question 17. Many people pulled only a character to help them clear the endgame, despite feeling hatred or indifference towards them, and we had 59% of respondents respond with yes. Now, I'll start off with this one, but I think going back to the previous points as well, I would say the game is also now pretty team focused, right? Where there's a lot more niches and whatnot, where if you do pull the niche unit, the performance is like far better than having a generalist support. Now, I know many times not too big of an issue for most players. For example, if you pull the Pink Remembrance team, I don't think anybody necessarily hates any of those characters if you're pulling for like that team, right? But then, let's see, we have the other side of things. We have Dahlia and Mortenex Blade, where if you don't have Dahlia, I'm gonna be honest, Break probably unplayable, and if you don't have Mortenex Blade, then follow-up in Acheron is unplayable. So for those players, this might suck a lot, where they have to pull a specific character, or else their account is legitimately bricked, to say the least. But what do you think, Alpaca?
Yeah, it's definitely pretty contentious. I know a lot of people, especially like Acheron mains, were really reluctant to pull Jiao Cho, partially because like a lot of people were saying he kind of had like NPC design. Um, I think I was a little bit in that camp, but I eventually did cave just because I wanted to see my Acheron do well. I think same for a lot of people with like Trivi. Um, there's no denying how strong like Trivi was at the time. Like even at E0 back then, and like nowadays, like with that E1 as well, like she still finds places in today's meta just because of how useful that utility of condensing AoE damage is. But depending on like how like your account is or like what your pull goals are, you might not want to pull for like three children characters who just like throw rockets everywhere. Like I even know someone who like just straight up skipped Dahlia for their Firefly just because they really were not a fan of her design and lore and stuff like that. And like me personally, I really did not like Dahlia at all. But like the power boost she offers, like I guess the numbers are really what drew me to her. So yeah.
I guess following up, starting with I think Jiao Cho, I thought like Jiao Cho was like the premier unit that probably came into most people's mind. Some people were saying he potentially may get a Nova Flare, but nobody really knows. But let's just say he might, right? Now, I suggested that you could put him in a dot team, right? Because of his E2. And I guess the amount of people in my comment sections that were repulsed by the idea of Jiao Cho jumping into the dot team was kind of crazy. And that's all I'm gonna say for him. But I think for, say, Dahlia, right? I think I didn't really feel too much in regards to like Dahlia either. I didn't really hate the character, but I'm just like, wow, the damage increase for my Firefly. That's crazy. I gotta pull. I gotta pull. Screw the character. I need performance.
Yep. Sometimes just like yeah, just meta performance just completely overrides like how much you may like or dislike the character. Everyone has their own preferences for sure. And across the survey, I noticed that about 78% of respondents had at least one unit with 35 or more substats. 34% had one with 40 or more, and then only 9% had a unit with 45 or more substats on them. So, yeah, I found this pretty interesting. What do you think, Ian?
Okay, you know what? I'm gonna be honest. I feel like there's a lot of discrepancy with this question and a prior one. Now, I think the first question that we answered right was the speed, the AV formula, right? Which, in my opinion, is pretty basic. Now, when we look at the results, right, with 35 substats, with 78%, like Dude, 35 substats is pretty damn insane, okay? I think many of my DPSs, which hover around probably say 38 to 40, right? 35 is still like easily like top 5% of build, most likely, depending on the character too. When I see a unit with say like 40 substats, that's easily top 1%. And 34% of people are top 1%. Look, man, I'm not quite sure because when I've seen my friends who are also playing the end game, you know, they don't they don't really reach that high, I'm gonna be honest. Like, not really close at all.
Well, I mean, there are certain ways to cheese it as well. Like, there's quite a couple of units that have like I believe like seven different effective substats. So you can kind of cheese it by just picking one of those characters. But I think also the fact that it's only asking for one unit, and with the prevalence of like variable dice and self-modeling resins, I think it's definitely doable to have at least like a single unit with like 35 or 40 substats. I think the problem just comes when you try to have like more than one unit with those requirements, because typically, like, at least for my own showcase, I'd say like 30 substats across the entire team is like on the very high end of like what my relics can afford. And I definitely don't like spend a low amount on this game, if I'm being honest.
If it's just like I guess any character, then yeah, you know what? I'll give it to them. Like having 35, 40, and 45% plus, honestly, it's pretty doable. But for DPSs, I would say like if you have DPSs that are these ratings, then like they're really dang well built.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think that affects like how people kind of see showcases as well. Like for most people, I believe like 30 substats is probably like the highest acceptable option, but I think even then, depending on how much you invest into a character, some players might even see that much as like unrelatable or unachievable like for their account.
Wait, sorry, did you say 30? 30 substats?
Yeah, like honestly, 30, I'd say a good build is probably 30 substats. Like if you're hitting 30, you're like I think you're more than endgame ready.
Oh, you know what? I would agree with you there. I think if it's like let's say like 27 to 30, realistically speaking, I think you can tackle the end game.
Now, according to the survey, about 36% of people have actually been able to copy clears, regardless of any additional cost they might have added due to maybe a discrepancy in relics or just not properly understanding how the rotation works. But it seems like they understood like the rotation and team concepts enough to where they were able to like get the same sort of results as what was being shown in showcase, which I think is really awesome. And I think that goes to show how useful a website like theherda.com can be for like endgame clears, for example.
I think when I heard this 36%, I'm gonna be honest, I'm just like, there's no way, okay? So if it's like say just YouTube or Bilibili and it's just like a normal run where they just maybe just copied of how to play it, then I'm just like, you know what? Absolutely, like this should be way higher. But then when I think of the Herda website and I'm just like 36%, I'm like, what those guys are doing, that's like the top 0.1% of players, okay? I have no idea what those guys are doing. And every time I've tried to replicate it, they have just like, I think I have pretty good relics, but those guys, they're like a different level. Plus, like they know all the speed tuning stuff. So like trying to like copy that where you have to like meet specific like breakpoints of like surviving with 1 HP, not to mention having the proper speed, dude, it's insane. So I'm just like 36% of y'all, where 33% of y'all don't know how to calculate AV, you know, has me, you know, questioning this question 52 result.
Yeah, I mean, you can technically see like the speed, right? And then just go for that breakpoint as like much as possible instead of trying to have to math it out. Hey, someone did all the math and all the moves for you, you know? So you can probably cobble together something close enough from there. But yeah, I definitely do agree that like there's certain things that you can't really figure out about a run, even if you watch it until you like really try it out yourself. So I think that's probably why it's like so much less than like even half, for example. But at the same time, like Star Rail is a turn-based game. At the end of the day, there's like only so many fixed inputs you have. So if you're able to like, if you have like the correct relics, the correct investments, then in theory at least, copying the clear shouldn't be too difficult so long as you like have all the RNG and steps line up. But I think the other big factor is too, it's like it doesn't just have to be zero cycles that can be copied. It can be like any clear. So if you look at like the low investment like E0 S1 clears that are like pretty popular on YouTube as well, like or maybe like they try to lower costs as much as possible, and then they have like explanations along the way with their thought processes. So yeah,
Okay, you know what? I think in regards to these, I guess, lower barrier of entry runs where they're using, say, like E0S1 or like no limit eidolons, yeah, like the popular YouTube channels which do a lot of showcases, I would say it's definitely like super possible to copy them. But I think one interesting thing is if you're looking at the competitive side or like the leaderboard side, then like a big barrier of entry, it's just going to be Eagle Von Wag, Eagle Von Wag. So, what are your thoughts about Eagle Von Wag, man? Because I feel like any of the top players, they probably have like a bunch of these laying around.
I mean, yeah, for sure. Just I think also it helps that typically if you're a longer time player, especially if you like started out in version one, like the only sets that were realistically worth farming at the time in terms of relics were like Quantum and Eagle, so you can definitely build up a repertoire. And I think it also helps that typically the most invaluable stat on Eagle is speed. So like once you get like one good Eagle set, or like even two or three, like you're able to pretty easily exchange those across all characters. Um, Instead of having to like farm is compared to like the opposite where it's like each character wants a specific like DPS set, for example. But yeah, it's definitely very uncommon, even still. Like, I know we had like really just like a super low amount of people that say that they zero cycled with like three Von Wax sets, which I kind of put there on purpose just to see like how like far certain players had gone. But yeah, I like it's not. I wouldn't say it's uncommon as well for certain accounts to maybe only have like one or zero Von Wax sets or like a single Eagle set per like Nihility that like really wants it, if any at all. You know, there's like the anti-Eagle sentiment as well, which I personally find kind of funny, but I guess I can kind of understand where it comes from since the other alternative is like ice sets, and also Eagle itself is like a very feast or famine set. It's like you either hit the speed break point and it does something for you, or you don't hit the speed break point and it is pretty much useless.
You know, speaking of that, I think on my account, I only have like one set of Eagle and I don't even use it. And I'm never gonna farm there because I don't want the ice set, okay? Getting the ice set on my account, it's basically breaking my account, okay? You put that double crit 4-line start in there, ice set, it's just gonna make you feel bad, okay? So I'm just like, it will be better off to not seeing those on my account than getting a good Eagle piece. So I'll be part of the anti-Eagle gang.
Okay. I mean, you can't always just like craft them, and I think like low key, even though I did talk about like Eagle being kind of useless once you like hit those speed breakpoints. Like the whole point of Eagle, farming Eagle set at least is to like actually like lower your speed breakpoint so you don't have to be like nearly as fast. Like hitting 200 speed versus like say 184 or like 160 or like perhaps potentially even lower, right? Um, I do think like if more players were bothered to farm it, then I think it would be like a net benefit for them, like or at least try and like craft them, because wasting your relic fragments on ice pieces is usually not ideal for most people. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that more people could look into. But again, going back to just how little people know about the action value formula, it's hard to say whether or not they'll actually get value from it. Similar to like the DDD question, and like whether or not they're better off served with just having more amp on their DPS through like the relics.
Not absolutely fair. But I think it'll be good to move on to our next section, which would actually pertain to Endgame. So Alpaca, I'll pass it off to you with 66 to 68.
All right. So Among these questions, these all discuss like zero cycles on one side of MOC, pure fiction, and apocalyptic shadow. One interesting thing is that the percentage zero cycles for Memory of Chaos is like significantly higher, like about 20% higher compared to pure fiction and Apoc Shadow, which I personally think makes a lot of sense. Like we've had a lot of absurd MOC buffs in the past where like it was usually pretty easy to just steamroll. Like for instance, that one skill buff for example that lets you like completely destroy like Svarog with like a one cost and Naxa, for example. Like that was like an easy zero cycle to do. And you know we have like matchups like Dark Sam or Choir versus like the Break archetype. We have like Archer when he released versus the True Sting, which was definitely not balanced to his model of HP if you're playing him with Sparkle. And you have like even Mono Remembrance versus Lygus, for example, or like Lygus versus Cyrene, really. She just absolutely destroys that matchup. But I think another thing is too that the thresholds for a zero cycle in MOC is like you get two waves basically. So a total of 300 action value, whereas with Pure Fiction and Apoc Shadow, the threshold for a zero cycle is usually considered to be 150 action value, or in other words, like half that time. So I guess that result makes sense when we think about it that way.
Oh, you know what? Okay, when you bring that up, you're absolutely right because you can absolutely cheese wave one, right? I know a lot of people they try to tune the HP of the enemies so they have like as many actions as they get to build up like as much energy, right? So with the statistic of 75% zero cycling at least MOC, you know what? That makes sense. But I think my initial impression was just like I feel like pure fiction should be the lowest, and then it would be APOC and then MOC, because I do think MOC like would be the easiest. So when I saw pure fiction and APOC like being pretty similar to each other, I'm gonna be honest, that was pretty surprising. Because in my opinion, I feel like pure fiction is kind of a like a DPS check, while APOC Shadow is kind of a particular niche or like shield check, because like sometimes there's some like absurd like stuff in there. I'm not sure if it's for this rotation this time around, but I'm pretty sure with the Flame Reaver, like back then, there was like particular dot buff where like with dot characters you had like literally infinite energy. Like you could just like clear like a 0 AV, I'm pretty sure. So just like some ridiculous buffs out there, which like should, I think in theory, like help APOC clears be like much faster.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think if you were running those like super shield archetypes during those times and you kind of had a general sense of what to do, it was usually pretty easy to zero cycle those. Um, and yeah, actually, now that you talk about it, I think the truth might actually be that it's the other way around, and it's because MOC is more widely accessible by other units. Perhaps that's why the zero cycle rate is so much higher versus something like Pure Fiction or Apoc Shadow, where it's like Pure Fiction is specifically an AoE check, and Apoc Shadow for the longest time was like specifically a break check and like check for specific elements of units, whereas MOC has much less restrictions in that regard.
Yeah, I think following on that, I think the HP, I'm not exactly sure on the values, but I would assume that MOC is quite a bit less because when I think about like accessibility, I think generally there's no like mechanic that's like explicitly like locking you out. Example, say like Fei Xiao in Apoc Shadow, where if you don't have dot or break, which is a decent alternative, like she's just not breaking, right? Well, if she were to appear in MOC, there's like no restriction for that, so it would be pretty easy to kill. I think, however, though, when it comes to the like the modifiers in MOC, I think there's been some absurd ones, like what you've been mentioning with, I believe it was Finon's banner release, where they had the like the crazy skill multiplier one. But I think generally though, the MOC buffs are pretty weak, if not negligible for like a lot of teams though. So I guess to have that 75%, it'll require the HP to be quite a bit less, if I had to assume.
Yeah, it might be just because MOC is generally balanced around like less of a shill, so it's more they do like lower the requirements for DPSing, so it's more accessible to a lot of units. Yeah.
Okay. But now that we've covered zero cycling one side of the endgame, let's see zero cycled at least two sides of the endgame. Now with questions 69, 70, and 71 with MOC, Pure Fiction, and finally APOG, we had 40%, 25%, and 22% having cleared both sides with zero cycles. Honestly, I'm not too good of a judge on how like difficult like this would be per se, because I guess my account is usually like it's all E2 DPSs, which is like really invested in, right? So for this, it was pretty easy for me. But then when I have switched to say like a friend's account, sometimes when I'm using like the newest DPSs at E0 S1, it's like it's really difficult, which is kind of surprising in my opinion. So like having both sides, I would assume for many of the casual players, it probably is less than like this 40, 25, and 22%, as I guess from what we've covered so far, a lot of these guys are probably not just casual and probably like a lot further ahead than that.
Yeah, I think also like true zero cycling as well. I think to a certain extent, it's probably like over twice as hard as zero cycling one side, just because not only do you have to build two good teams, but those two teams obviously have to be unique, right? So that brings up the idea of like opportunity cost, right? Whatever units you can't use in one team, you can use in the other team. But then if you take that, if let's say like for example the Trailblazer, right? Just because there's only one Trailblazer. Obviously, if you use them in one team, you can't use them in the second team. And even for like support as supposedly versatile as E4 Welt, you can't use them on both sides, despite like whatever people may say about his cost. He's still like one unit at the end of the day.
You know, okay, so there's two, but I think soon enough, right? We're expecting three, what's it called? Like three stages in each of the end game modes. And I think for me, of having like a solid team, it's taken me, I think, let's see, since version 2 to version 4. So I believe that's here like 2.5 years to get like three like really solid teams. I literally just picked up my third one with Evanescence and Elation. And I spend a little bit of money to say the least. So for I guess like other people with like the introduction of now three teams, it might get a bit hard to say the least.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's definitely gonna get a lot harder, especially since now not only do you have to think about okay, if I use this character here, I can't use him in team two. It's I can't use this character in team two and three, and also I need like three times the overall characters compared to just like clearing one side in order to successfully clear endgame. So honestly, I think we'll have to see. Like for instance, this Star Wars APOC Shadow, we had a I'd say we had a pretty easy sign for Colia, kind of a medium stage in Reaver that could also be cheesed if you had the correct matchups, mechanics, met the DPS checks, and then a really hard one with Ecor. So, well, with the Pure Fiction coming out as the time of this recording, I think we'll just have to see how much harder that difficulty ends up becoming.
Absolutely. But I guess while we're on the topic of three teams, why don't you start off with the next mode that requires three teams?
So obviously, before Starboard mode, we also had Anomaly Arbitration as our very first three-game mode, and that one's definitely a lot more interesting, especially since, unlike the other game modes, which come with tailored buffs, these modes typically come with tailored debuffs to make things even harder, and they usually don't make the difficulty easier to offset this as well. That's probably why we see so little, like relatively speaking, zero cycles and like even like 9-star clears. The amount of players that were able to 9-star Anomaly Arbitration's night stages is less than those who could zero cycle like either MOC, Pure Fiction, or Apocalyptic Shadow. So yeah, three team content it at its hardest is definitely like a step up. Even just like two cycling every single game mode can be much harder than zero cycling in any game mode once you have like three teams to keep track of.
I think one thing that's interesting is like that you mentioned, not only do you need three teams, but now you have to account for the debuff. And then I think like enemies too, like that's also a factor, right? Now that you have to account for all three of these different factors, like if you're not getting shilled or potentially you have a bad matchup, I'm gonna be honest, I really don't think there's like much you can do, right? Because I think like some bosses, for example, you're gonna really want elation, although you can brute force it. And I guess if you don't use elation, for example, and you get like heavily punished. Some modifiers have just been like super brutal. For example, I think the energy ones where you start with zero energy for like some people, like extremely difficult. I believe it was like maybe one anomaly arbitration back, or two maybe, but it was Flame Reaver on the second node where they had extremely high amounts of HP and it just took away all your energy. So trying to clear in like 2 cycles without say like an AoE team or just something that had like immense amount of damage, like rough. So if you weren't clearing with 9 stars, you know that's like to be expected. I think Anomaly Arbitration is quite a bit a big step like up in regards to difficulty compared to our current modes right now, right? With APOC, MOC, and Pure Fiction. So if you are able to say 9-star these stages, then I think you're doing like super well, or at least you planned super well.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think Anomaly Arbitration is easily the hardest content we've gotten, even with the introduction of Star Work mode. I think just because, yeah, we don't have like those kinds of like really crippling buffs that lock out archetypes like we do, like compared to like Pure Fiction, APOC Shadow, Memory of Chaos, where they tend to have buffs more so to help out your team. It's definitely a lot more of a challenge, I'd say. And I'm also kind of glad that Anon Arbitration, for that reason, doesn't really have any jades or like any pulls locked behind endgame rewards. Though, of course, there still is the matter of the dice, which are important too. But I guess in that way, it also makes me a little bit optimistic about endgame in the future, since it seems like even though we are shifting towards 3 team content, the 3 team content still does seem to retain like the same buffs and a buff oriented playstyle rather than like a debuff oriented obstacle.
I would say if they are switching to a 3-team format, I think as long as they give us some like grace period to adjust and like start building another team, I think it would be pretty good. But if they just like keep the current difficulty and just have a whole another team requirement, then I think that might be too much. But I think currently with the current let's see Apoc Shadow version with the 3 stages, I think it's done pretty fairly well. But having seen like example the Pure Fiction rework where they kept it pretty easy the first 2 times and then like after that they like omega inflated it, so I'm just hoping something like that doesn't happen for our future modes.
Yeah, and realistically, I think only time will tell, but I am personally in kind of the skeptic camp of that not really happening again. I'm pretty sure it will inevitably happen, but who knows? Hopefully, at least they'll give us the resources to catch up and stay caught up. Yeah, so those are kind of some of our thoughts on the topics that were discussed in this survey. If you're curious to see how your favorite creators did, we have a couple. We have a couple here. I do find it kind of pretty interesting how it's like we have like all the beta analysis creators in like this one circle. We have like the showcase YouTubers kind of all here, and then we have like the more I guess hardcore showcasers up here, and then at the very top somehow we have the ones with like a bunch of like pull on Twitter for I guess lack of better context. I guess it definitely does help that the quiz specifies you specifically. So technically, if you play on multiple different accounts, this it's much easier to score higher on this quiz. But I'd also just like to say that this is not necessarily a reflection of like skill or anything. I was also the one who made this quiz, so it's like there's a lot of my own biases and stuff in here. This doesn't really speak anything to like the credibility or like how good quote unquote like each of these creators are. I just kind of have this on for fun.
Wait, I do have a question. Okay, speaking of scores, how do you feel about your personal score of 71?
Um, well, I mean, what 71's like a it's like a C, right? In like the American grading system, so it's passing in that respect. I mean, I guess it makes sense that I'd be on the higher end since I do spend a lot on the game. And also, like, I do like try doing some insane things now and then. So low key, I think what I kind of consider to be like quote unquote average is a little bit is a lot higher than what other people might consider average. I don't know. Enough about me though. What do you think of your score of 56?
Okay, I think the number of 56 is a pretty satisfying number to look at, right? But I guess in the context at looking at all these other different creators, all I can realistically say is, a larp Sahur, 56. Oh my days, man. It is relatively low, okay? But, compared to the average player, it's a lot higher because of the content that I do. But then, okay, you know what? A lot of the questions I couldn't even answer because I'm just not good enough, okay? Like, doing all the SK Herta stuff, man, it's too much, okay? So, I'm gonna be honest, although those, I guess the Twitter and Reddit guys, you guys are right, I'm a bit of a LARPer, but, 56, not too bad, not too shabby, okay?
I guess for all of y'all in the comments, do y'all think setting an average, designing a quiz like an average of 34 is perhaps a bit too harsh? Like, should I make this quiz like easier or harder next time I go through it? Like, are there any other questions that you'd like me to cover? Um, like, I don't know, do you want like more creators on? Yeah, just feel free to let me know in the comments. And yeah, thanks. I guess thanks again to everyone who participated in the survey. Ultimately, this was just for fun. I just wanted to share some results with a very cool creator and low key just have an excuse to collab with them. And so I think with that, Yoon, do you have any final words that you'd like to
Yeah.
add?
Yeah, I actually do. I think in regards to Mr. Alpaca Deck, it's actually been an honor to work with. I've known them for, I think at this point, at least like a year or two. Sometimes, no, at least like a year and a half, I would say. But I don't really reach out to any creators. So when my friend or IRL friend was able to link me and him up, I thought that was actually so cool, right? And then working with him has been an absolute blast, right? I can see that we're actually like both putting in like our effort making all the stuff. Like the fact he went through all the data and organized and all of that, I bet took a lot of work. But when we had to go through all the different questions or the ones we had to pick up and like we collaborated with it, it's like we're on the same wavelength. So like everything was like pretty smooth, I would say, for the most part. So I guess for any creators who sees this, if you want to work with Alpaca Deck, it's super awesome to work with. But also, I hope you guys like the thumbnail, I made that.
Yeah, I think Yoon's definitely got a bit better of a handle on thumbnails than I do. I just make mine in Google Slides, man. But yeah, honestly, thank you so much for coming on this collab with me. Low key, there were a lot of like technical issues behind the vaccines that he also helped out with. So hey, don't let him downplay his accomplishment, like how much he had to accommodate for this collab. So yeah, I think for yeah, there just a lot of hiccups from this being both of our first collab, but yeah,
Oh,
hope you guys enjoyed. If there's anything else you'd like to see from us in the future, let us know in the comments. And yeah, with
wait,
that, I guess
wait,
I'll.
wait. I want to say one thing.
What?
I think you should include this part in too. But I want to say you guys should like and subscribe because I feel like we both did a pretty good job with this. I'm not exactly sure how long it would be, but I think it would be a pretty long video. So Alpaca Deck, he's going to have to put in a lot of time editing, which I'm not sure for how long, but you should totally reward him with some, like and subs here and there. Or also maybe check out my channel. Maybe you'll like it too, but who knows?
Yeah, totally. Gee, I'm not good with outros. How do we end this?
No,
Have a
no,
great day, y'all.
you could just use mine. Wait. You can say just say like thank you so much and then like blah blah blah. Or like, thank you
Okie
so much for
dokie.
watching. Thank you so much for watching and blah blah blah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for watching, and hope y'all have a great day.